A cleaning lady who never went to school taught 10 languages to a millionaire's son. When doctors said the boy would never speak again, she proved them all wrong. But when the truth about who she really was came to light, everyone realized this was never just about languages. It was about two broken souls finding healing in the most unexpected way. A story of hidden wisdom, second chances, and the power of seeing someone's true potential when the whole world has given up. Get ready, because this story will touch your heart in ways you never imagined. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and comment below where you're watching from. Nobody saw when she first entered that house. Not even the trained eyes of the oldest housekeeper noticed the difference. Perhaps because she wore the same uniform as all the others, or because she walked with steps too light to draw attention. But there was something different about her, something that couldn't be explained with an identification badge or formal resume. Not on that first day. Only later, when the impossible began to happen, did the residents of the mansion realize that this invisible woman carried an entire world hidden beneath her cleaning rags. She was hired hastily, as a temporary replacement for a worker on leave. She had no complete documents, no verifiable references. She claimed to have grown up in the countryside, without access to school, learning everything on her own. That was enough for her to be placed in the service wing, away from the wealthy family's eyes. A convenient detail for everyone, including her, who seemed to prefer the silence. But what nobody knew was that behind that quiet manner lay a story of losses, emotional exiles, and an intelligence that never needed diplomas to prove itself. The mansion was cold, though sunlight streamed through the tall windows. The boy of the house rarely left his room. He had been diagnosed with severe speech blockage since he was 4 years old. The best doctors in the country had tried everything. No results. Now, at 8, the child was already treated as a special case, someone who needed care, but whom nobody knew how to handle anymore. Not even his father, a prestigious businessman accustomed to solving problems with money and quick decisions. The boy, for his part, walked through the house like a whisper. He was there, but it was as if he wasn't. The first important event wasn't noticed by anyone. The new cleaning lady, while cleaning the forgotten library at the back of the house, hummed an old song in a language nobody recognized. She didn't do it provocatively, just because the melody calmed her mind. What she didn't know was that behind the bookshelf, the boy heard everything. The next day, upon seeing the woman again in the library, he whispered the final word of that song. Low, shy, but audible. She turned without surprise, just smiled. Responded in another language, also ancient. He smiled back. That's how it all began. In the months that followed, the library became a quiet space of exchange. There was no blackboard, no desks, just rugs and forgotten books in foreign languages. The woman passed by there in the middle of her tasks, and the boy was always nearby. He began to repeat words, then phrases, then to mix languages naturally, like someone playing with building blocks. The staff noticed something strange, but said nothing. The boy smiled more, and spoke with her, only with her. The first small twist came when the housekeeper questioned the cleaning lady's frequency in the noble wing of the house. The woman responded sweetly, "I'm cleaning the books." Nothing more was said, but the discomfort remained. Margaret Whitfield had worked in the Hampton estate for 15 years. She had seen servants come and go, watched the family's fortunes rise and fall, witnessed the slow transformation of young Master Timothy from a chattering toddler into a silent ghost who haunted the mansion's endless corridors. She prided herself on knowing everything that happened under that roof. Every creak of the floorboards, every whispered conversation in the servants' quarters, every tear that fell in the privacy of locked rooms. But this new woman, this Elena Santos, was different. Too different. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as Elena moved across the estate's grounds, her cleaning cart trailing behind her like a faithful companion. There was something in the way she carried herself, a dignity that seemed out of place for someone who claimed to have never set foot in a classroom. Her English was flawless, though touched with an accent that seemed to shift depending on whom she was speaking with. Sometimes it sounded vaguely European, other times it carried hints of something more exotic, more distant. The boy's father, Jonathan Hampton, had built his fortune in international trade. His warehouses dotted the coastline from Boston to Charleston, filled with goods from every corner of the world. Coffee from Brazil, textiles from India, spices from Morocco, all of it flowing through his hands like water, turning to gold the moment it touched American soil. But for all his success in understanding foreign markets, He had never learned to understand his own son. Timothy's condition had begun after his mother's death 3 years earlier. The specialists called it selective mutism, a trauma response that locked words inside his throat like prisoners in a cell. Jonathan had spent a fortune on therapists, speech specialists, even alternative healers, who claimed they could unlock the mysteries of the human mind. Nothing worked. The boy would sit in their offices, staring at their charts and toys and carefully designed exercises, his lips sealed as tight as a tomb. But something was changing now. Margaret noticed it first in the way Timothy moved through the house. Where once he had drifted like smoke, barely there at all, now he seemed to have purpose. He lingered in certain rooms longer than before. He stopped to examine things, books, paintings, the patterns of light that fell across the marble floors. And sometimes, just sometimes, she could swear she heard him humming. Elena had been working at the estate for 6 weeks when Margaret decided to investigate. She waited until the cleaning woman was working in the East Wing library, then positioned herself in the adjoining music room, pretending to dust the grand piano while straining to hear what was happening on the other side of the wall. The library had been Timothy's mother's favorite room. Sarah Hampton had been a linguistics professor before her marriage, speaking 7 languages fluently and collecting rare books in scripts that looked like artwork to untrained eyes. After her death, Jonathan had ordered the room sealed off, unable to bear the memories it contained. But recently, Margaret had noticed the door standing slightly ajar, and now she understood why. Through the thin wall, she could hear Elena's voice, soft and melodic, speaking in what sounded like Spanish? No, something else. Portuguese, perhaps. The words rose and fell like music, painting pictures in a language Margaret didn't understand, but somehow felt in her bones. And then, impossibly, she heard Timothy's voice joining in, not copying but responding, as if he understood every word. Margaret's heart nearly stopped. She pressed her ear closer to the wall, hardly daring to breathe. The conversation continued for several minutes, switching between languages like dancers changing partners. She caught fragments that sounded like French, then something that might have been Italian, and then sounds she couldn't even begin to identify. When silence finally fell, Margaret hurried away from the music room, her mind reeling. She needed to tell someone about this, but who would believe her? Timothy Hampton, who hadn't spoken a complete sentence in English in 3 years, was apparently fluent in languages most people had never heard of, and he was learning them from a cleaning woman who claimed to have never been to school. That evening, Margaret found herself pacing the servants' hall, unable to concentrate on her usual tasks. The other staff members noticed her agitation, but knew better than to pry. Margaret Whitfield was not a woman who shared her concerns lightly. She had kept the Hampton family's secrets for 15 years, from Jonathan's occasional drinking binges to Sarah's struggles with depression in the months before her death. She understood the weight of knowledge and the responsibility that came with it. But this was different. This involved Timothy, and Margaret had always harbored a special tenderness for the boy. She had been there the night he was born, had helped Sarah through those first difficult weeks of motherhood, had watched him take his first steps in the very library where he now spent his afternoons, learning impossible things from an impossible woman. The next morning, Margaret made her decision. She would speak to Mr. Hampton directly. She found him in his study, surrounded by the usual chaos of international commerce. Shipping manifests covered his desk like fallen leaves, and the telephone seemed to ring every few minutes with urgent matters requiring his immediate attention. He looked up when Margaret knocked, his expression showing the polite but distant interest he reserved for household concerns. "Mr. Hampton," Margaret began, choosing her words carefully, "I believe there's something you should know about your son." Jonathan's face immediately shifted, the businessman's mask falling away to reveal the worried father beneath. He gestured for her to sit, pushing aside a stack of papers to give her his full attention. Margaret told him everything. The conversations she had overheard, the change in Timothy's behavior, the way Elena seemed to move through the house with an almost supernatural awareness of where the boy would be at any given moment. She spoke carefully, trying to present facts rather than suspicions, but she could see the skepticism growing in Jonathan's eyes. "Margaret," he said finally, his voice gentle but firm, "I know you care about Timothy. We all do. But selective mutism is a serious condition. The doctors have been very clear about this. Timothy's silence isn't something that can be cured by whatever it is you think you've witnessed." But Jonathan couldn't entirely dismiss what Margaret had told him. That afternoon, he found himself walking past the library more frequently than usual, listening for sounds from within. He told himself he was being foolish, that grief and hope were making him hear things that weren't there. But when he finally gathered the courage to peer through the slightly open door, what he saw stopped him cold. Timothy was sitting cross-legged on the Persian rug, a large book open in his lap. Elena knelt beside him, pointing to words on the page while speaking in what sounded like German. Jonathan spoke enough German to recognize it, a remnant of business dealings with clients in Austria and Switzerland. But this wasn't the halting, formal German of boardroom conversations. This was fluent, natural, the kind of German one learned at a mother's knee rather than in a classroom. And Timothy was responding. Not just nodding or pointing, but speaking actual words in actual German. His young voice clear and confident as he read from the book in his lap. Jonathan gripped the doorframe, feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The doctors had told him that Timothy's condition might improve with time, but they had warned that progress would be slow and uncertain. They had certainly never suggested that he might suddenly develop fluency in foreign languages. He watched for several more minutes, afraid to move or make any sound that might break the spell. Elena's teaching method seemed to involve no formal structure at all. She would point to a picture in the book, say a word in German, then ask Timothy to repeat it. When he did, she would smile and offer the word in what sounded like another language entirely. Timothy absorbed it all like a sponge, his face lit with an enthusiasm Jonathan hadn't seen since before Sarah's death. Finally, Elena seemed to sense his presence. She looked up, meeting his eyes through the crack in the door, and smiled with the kind of serene confidence that suggested she had been expecting this moment. She whispered something to Timothy, who carefully closed the book and stood up, brushing dust from his clothes. Jonathan stepped back as they approached the door, trying to compose himself. When Elena emerged from the library, Timothy trailing behind her like a shadow, she offered him a small nod of acknowledgement. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hampton," she said, her accent today carrying just a trace of something that might have been German. "I hope you don't mind." Timothy was curious about his mother's books. The mention of Sarah hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He looked down at his son, who was watching the exchange with bright, alert eyes that seemed to hold secrets Jonathan couldn't begin to imagine. What language were you speaking?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena's smile was gentle, patient. "German," she replied. "Timothy has a gift for sounds. He remembers everything he hears. But where did you learn German?" Elena finished. "The same place I learned Portuguese and French and Italian and all the others. From people who needed to be understood. From books that needed to be read. From songs that needed to be sung." Jonathan stared at her, trying to reconcile this woman who spoke of languages like collections of butterflies, with the simple cleaning lady he had hired to dust his furniture and mop his floors. There was something in her eyes, a depth that spoke of experiences far beyond what her modest circumstances would suggest. Timothy tugged at Elena's sleeve and whispered something in what Jonathan was now certain was German. She nodded and whispered back, their conversation brief, but clearly meaningful. Then Timothy looked up at his father, and in perfect English said, "She's teaching me about Mama's books." It was the first complete sentence Jonathan had heard his son speak in over a year. That night, Jonathan called Dr. Patterson, Timothy's primary therapist, and described what he had witnessed. The doctor listened with professional skepticism, offering explanations about regression and fantasy, and the dangerous tendency of grieving parents to see miracles where none existed. But Jonathan had seen what he had seen, and heard what he had heard. Timothy was speaking. Maybe not to everyone, and maybe not in English, but he was speaking. The next few days passed in a strange suspended animation. Jonathan found himself constantly alert for sounds from the library, while trying to maintain the pretense that nothing had changed. He watched Elena move through her daily routines with new eyes, noticing things he had overlooked before. The way she paused to examine the spines of books in any room that had them. The way she sometimes moved her lips slightly, as if rehearsing words in languages he couldn't identify. The way Timothy seemed to anticipate her presence, appearing in whatever room she was cleaning as if drawn by some invisible signal. Margaret, meanwhile, had become Elena's unofficial guardian, deflecting questions from the other staff members and running interference when necessary. She didn't entirely trust the cleaning woman. There were too many mysteries, too many things that didn't add up, but she trusted Timothy's happiness. For the first time since his mother's death, the boy seemed truly alive. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon in late October. Jonathan was in his study, reviewing contracts for a new shipping route to Mediterranean ports, when he heard laughter echoing through the mansion's halls. Real laughter, bright and joyful and completely unfamiliar. He followed the sound through corridors lined with portraits of long-dead Hamptons, past rooms that had been closed off since Sarah's death, until he found himself standing outside the conservatory. Through the glass doors, he could see Timothy and Elena sitting among Sarah's abandoned orchids. The plants had been neglected for 3 years, their exotic blooms withering away until only stubborn green leaves remained. But Elena had apparently been tending them during her cleaning rounds, because several were showing signs of new growth, tiny buds that promised future flowers. Timothy was holding a small notebook, reading aloud from pages covered in handwriting that looked nothing like his usual childish scrawl. As Jonathan listened, he realized his son was speaking in multiple languages, switching between them effortlessly as he read what appeared to be descriptions of the orchids around them. Elena listened with the focused attention of a master teacher, occasionally offering gentle corrections or encouraging nods. When Timothy finished reading, Elena clapped her hands together and said something in what sounded like Spanish. Timothy's face lit up with pride, and he responded in the same language, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. Jonathan pushed open the conservatory door, no longer caring if he interrupted their lesson. Both Timothy and Elena looked up as he entered, the boy's expression shifting from joy to something approaching fear, as if he had been caught doing something forbidden. "Don't stop," Jonathan said, settling himself on one of the wrought iron chairs that Sarah had loved. "Please, I'd like to listen." Elena studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing something in her mind. Then she smiled and gestured to the notebook in Timothy's hands. "Timothy has been writing about the orchids," she explained, "in different languages. He wants to understand how different cultures see the same flower." Jonathan looked at his son. This boy who had been silent for so long that everyone had begun to treat him as if he were made of glass. Now Timothy was creating poetry in languages Jonathan couldn't even name, his young mind making connections that seemed impossible for someone his age. Would you read me something?" Jonathan asked, his voice carefully neutral. Timothy glanced at Elena, who nodded encouragingly. Then, in a voice that grew stronger with each word, he began to read. The first passage was in English, describing the way morning light caught the edges of the orchid petals like tiny prisms. Then he switched to what sounded like Italian, the words flowing like music as he painted the same scene with different sounds and rhythms. Next came something Jonathan thought might be Portuguese, followed by French that was so perfectly accented it might have come from the streets of Paris. As his son read, Jonathan felt something breaking open inside his chest. This was not just recovery from trauma. This was genius, pure and simple, blooming in the most unexpected place imaginable. And it was being nurtured by a woman who claimed to have learned everything she knew from life itself, without the benefit of formal education or academic credentials. When Timothy finished reading, the conservatory fell silent, except for the soft sound of water dripping from the irrigation system Elena had apparently repaired. Jonathan looked at Elena, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since she had arrived at his home. "Who are you?" he asked, the question carrying the weight of weeks of accumulated wonder and confusion. Elena's answer was simple, delivered with the kind of quiet certainty that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you belong in the world. "I am someone who believes that knowledge belongs to everyone, Mr. Hampton, even those who never had the chance to sit in a classroom, especially them." That evening, after Timothy had gone to bed clutching his notebook of multilingual orchid descriptions, Jonathan found himself alone with questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve themselves. He walked through his mansion, seeing it now through different eyes. The library that had been sealed for 3 years was alive again, filled with the sound of learning and discovery. The conservatory bloomed with renewed life, tended by hands that understood the language of growing things. Even the servants' quarters hummed with a different energy, as if Elena's presence had somehow lifted the entire household. He thought about Sarah, about the dreams she had harbored for their son's education. She had wanted Timothy to grow up speaking multiple languages, to understand the world as a vast tapestry of different cultures and perspectives. Her death had ended those dreams, or so Jonathan had believed. Now, impossibly, they were coming true in ways Sarah never could have imagined. But questions remained. Elena Santos was clearly much more than she appeared to be. Her knowledge was too vast, her teaching methods too sophisticated, her understanding of Timothy's needs too intuitive for someone who had simply picked up languages by chance. There was a story behind her presence in his house, a story she had not yet chosen to tell. Jonathan made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would ask Elena to join him for dinner. Not as an employee, but as someone whose presence in their lives had become essential in ways he was only beginning to understand. He would ask her to tell him the truth about who she was and why she had come to them. And then, depending on her answers, he would have to decide whether to let her continue transforming his son's life, or whether the risks of the unknown were too great to bear. Outside, October winds rattled the mansion's windows, carrying with them the scent of changing seasons and the promise of transformations yet to come. In the library, forgotten books whispered secrets in a dozen different languages, waiting for eager hands to turn their pages. And in Timothy's room, a small boy dreamed in words he had never been taught, building bridges between worlds with nothing more than curiosity and the guidance of a woman who carried libraries in her heart. The first phase of an impossible education was complete, but the real lessons were just beginning. The dinner invitation came on a Friday evening, delivered by Margaret with an expression that suggested she thought her employer had lost his mind. Elena received the news while folding towels in the laundry room, her hands never pausing in their methodical work, even as her eyes registered something that might have been surprise, or perhaps resignation. "Mr. Hampton requests your presence at dinner tomorrow evening," Margaret announced, her tone carefully neutral. 8 o'clock, in the small dining room. Elena nodded, continuing to fold the towels with the same precise attention she brought to everything else. The silence stretched between them until Margaret felt compelled to add, "You don't have to accept, you know. This is unusual." For the first time since Margaret had known her, Elena smiled with something that approached genuine amusement. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, her accent today carrying hints of something that might have been Irish. "In my experience, the most important conversations always happen in unusual circumstances." Margaret left the laundry room more confused than ever. There was something about Elena's response that suggested she had been expecting this invitation, as if she had been waiting for Jonathan Hampton to finally ask the questions that had been building in his mind for weeks. It was the confidence of someone who held all the cards in a game everyone else was still trying to understand. That evening, Timothy appeared in the kitchen after dinner, seeking Elena with the instinctive certainty of a compass finding true north. He found her preparing cleaning supplies for the next day's work, her movements efficient and practiced despite the distraction of whatever thoughts occupied her mind. "Elena," Timothy said, switching to French with the casual ease that had become second nature, "will you tell me about tomorrow?" She looked down at him, seeing something in his expression that made her set aside her work and give him her full attention. Timothy had developed an uncanny ability to sense undercurrents in the household, perhaps because his years of silence had taught him to read people through observation rather than words. "Your father wants to talk," she replied in the same language, sitting on one of the kitchen stools so they were at eye level. "He has questions about who I am and why I'm here." Timothy considered this with the gravity of someone much older than his 8 years. "Are you going to tell him the truth?" Elena's pause lasted just long enough to suggest that the truth was more complicated than a simple yes or no. "Which truth would you like me to tell him?" "The one that matters," Timothy said, switching to English with the kind of directness that children sometimes possess. "The one about why you understand me." That night, Elena sat in her small room in the servants' quarters, staring at a photograph she kept hidden in a wooden box beneath her few possessions. The picture showed a young woman in graduation robes, standing beside an older man with kind eyes and graying hair. Both wore expressions of pride and accomplishment, frozen in a moment of triumph that seemed to belong to another lifetime. Elena touched the glass covering the photograph, her fingers tracing the face of the young woman who had once believed that knowledge and credentials were the same thing. Dr. Elena Maria Santos had graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown University at the age of 22, with a doctorate in applied linguistics and a specialty in childhood language acquisition disorders. She had spoken 9 languages fluently and was working on her 10th when her world collapsed in ways that had nothing to do with academic achievement and everything to do with the messy unpredictability of human life. The man in the photograph was her father, Professor Miguel Santos, who had spent 30 years teaching Romance languages at a small college in Maryland. He had been her first teacher, her inspiration, and her closest friend. He had also been the reason she discovered that sometimes the most important knowledge couldn't be found in any classroom. Miguel Santos had grown up in poverty in rural Portugal, the son of illiterate farmers who worked other people's land for barely enough to survive. He had learned to read by candlelight, using newspapers that blew across the fields and books borrowed from the village priest. By the time he was 12, he was teaching other children in his village, creating lessons from whatever materials he could find. His gift for languages had earned him a scholarship to university, then graduate school, then eventually a position in America where he could build the life he had dreamed of as a hungry child studying by flickering light. But Miguel had never forgotten where he came from, or the children who learned in barns and kitchens because schools were luxuries they couldn't afford. Throughout Elena's childhood, their small house had been filled with visitors. Migrant workers learning English, refugees struggling with paperwork, elderly immigrants trying to write letters to families in distant countries. Miguel taught them all, asking nothing in return except the satisfaction of watching comprehension dawn in their eyes. Elena had grown up believing that this was what education meant, not the accumulation of degrees or credentials, but the simple act of helping people understand and be understood. She had planned to follow in her father's footsteps, to use her doctorate to create programs for underserved communities, to prove that intelligence and wisdom existed everywhere, regardless of formal schooling. Then came the morning when she found Miguel collapsed in his study, surrounded by the papers he had been grading late into the night. The stroke had been massive and sudden, leaving him unable to speak the languages that had been his life's passion. The doctors said he might recover some function with time and therapy. But Elena watched her eloquent, multilingual father struggle to remember the English word for water, and she understood that some losses couldn't be healed with medical intervention. She had taken a leave of absence from her newly started position at a prestigious research institute to care for him. The leave became permanent when the medical bills mounted and her father's condition deteriorated. Elena sold everything, her car, her furniture, her collection of rare linguistic texts, to pay for treatments that showed little promise of success. When that wasn't enough, she took work wherever she could find it, cleaning houses and offices while Miguel slept in the afternoons, tutoring children in the evenings when he was lucid enough to be left alone. The work was honest and necessary, but it was also invisible. Elena discovered that when you carried a mop instead of a diploma, people stopped seeing you as a person with thoughts and knowledge and feelings. You became part of the furniture, present but not important, useful but not valued. It was a kind of erasure that happened gradually, so subtly that you might not notice it, until one day you realized you had been speaking to someone for 10 minutes, and they hadn't looked at your face once. Miguel died on a Tuesday in early spring, slipping away in his sleep while Elena was at the grocery store buying ingredients for the soup he had loved as a child in Portugal. She found him when she returned, peaceful and still, his hand resting on a book of Pablo Neruda's poetry written in the original Spanish. Elena sat beside him for 3 hours, reading the poems aloud in all the languages they had shared, saying goodbye to the man who had taught her that words were bridges between souls. After the funeral, Elena packed her few remaining possessions and left Maryland. She had no destination in mind, only a need to move, to find some place where she could figure out how to exist in a world without her father's guidance. She drove north until her ancient car broke down outside a small Connecticut town, and there she stayed, taking work where she could find it, living quietly and carefully while she decided what to do with the rest of her life. The Hampton estate had been just another cleaning job, a way to pay rent and buy groceries while she considered her options. She hadn't expected to find Timothy, a boy whose silence spoke to her in ways that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with recognition. She saw in him something she understood viscerally, the isolation that comes from being misunderstood, the loneliness of having thoughts and feelings that don't fit into other people's expectations, the particular sadness of being overlooked by those who should see you most clearly. When Timothy first responded to her singing, Elena felt something awaken in her that had been dormant since her father's death. The joy of connection, of communication, of watching understanding bloom in someone else's mind. It reminded her why she had fallen in love with languages in the first place. Not for the academic prestige or the intellectual challenge, but for the simple miracle of human beings reaching across the void to touch each other's thoughts. Now, holding her father's photograph and preparing for tomorrow's dinner with Jonathan Hampton, Elena faced a choice that would determine not just her own future, but Timothy's as well. She could tell the truth about her background, about the doctorate hidden in a box of papers she never looked at anymore, about the research and publications and academic honors that belonged to a person she wasn't sure she still was. Or she could continue to let them believe she was exactly what she appeared to be, a cleaning woman who had stumbled onto an extraordinary gift. The truth would change everything. Jonathan Hampton was a businessman who understood credentials and qualifications, who hired experts to solve problems and measured success in quantifiable results. If he knew about her education, he would want to formalize her role with Timothy, to create structured lessons and measurable goals, and all the bureaucratic apparatus that turned learning into work. He would mean well, but he would also fundamentally misunderstand what was happening between her and his son. What Timothy needed wasn't another expert with another set of techniques and strategies. He needed someone who understood that healing happened in its own time, in its own way, according to rules that couldn't be written in any textbook. He needed someone who could sit with his silence until he was ready to break it, who could offer words without demanding them in return, who could see him as a complete person rather than a problem to be solved. Elena put the photograph away and made her decision. Tomorrow, she would tell Jonathan Hampton exactly as much of the truth as he needed to hear, and no more. She would protect Timothy's healing process, even if it meant protecting it from his own father's good intentions. Some secrets were worth keeping when they served a greater purpose. The next evening arrived with the kind of October chill that promised winter was not far away. Elena spent the day working as usual, cleaning and organizing and tending to the small tasks that kept a large household running smoothly. She had chosen her clothes carefully, a simple navy dress that Margaret had helped her select from the items donated to the local church, modest but neat enough for dinner in the Hampton family's private dining room. Timothy found her in the late afternoon, as she was finishing her work in the conservatory. He had been spending more time there lately, drawn by the orchids that Elena had coaxed back to life, and by the quality of light that filtered through the glass ceiling in the hours before sunset. "Are you nervous?" he asked in Portuguese, a language that had become their private code for conversations about feelings too complicated for his limited English vocabulary. "A little," Elena admitted, settling beside him on the wrought iron bench where his mother used to sit to read. "Your father loves you very much. Sometimes that makes it harder to say difficult things." Timothy nodded with the wisdom of a child who had learned early that love and understanding didn't always coincide. "Will you still teach me if he says no?" Elena looked at him, this boy who had become so important to her in such a short time, and felt her heart clench with protective tenderness. "Timothy," she said, switching to English so there could be no misunderstanding, "no one can stop you from learning. The only question is whether they'll help or get in the way." At 8 o'clock exactly, Elena knocked on the door of the small dining room, the one the family used for informal meals when they weren't entertaining business associates or social obligations. Margaret had set the table with everyday china rather than the formal service, a small kindness that suggested she understood this was meant to be a conversation rather than an interrogation. Jonathan Hampton stood when she entered, a gesture of courtesy that surprised her. In her months of working in his house, he had been polite but distant, treating her with the same absent-minded consideration he showed all his household staff. Tonight, however, he looked at her with the focused attention she usually saw him reserve for important business meetings. "Please, sit," he said, indicating the chair across from him. "Margaret will bring dinner shortly." They sat in silence for a moment, each taking the measure of the other. Elena noticed that Jonathan looked tired, older than his 43 years, with lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worries that money couldn't solve. He, in turn, seemed to be seeing her clearly for the first time, noting the way she held herself with quiet dignity, despite her humble circumstances, the intelligence that showed in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. Margaret arrived with the first course, a simple soup that filled the room with the comfortable smell of herbs and vegetables. She served them both with professional efficiency, but Elena caught the worried glance the housekeeper sent in her direction before withdrawing. Margaret had grown fond of Elena over the past months, and she clearly feared that this dinner might result in changes no one wanted. When they were alone again, Jonathan took a breath and began the conversation they had both been anticipating. "I want to thank you," he said carefully, "for what you've done for Timothy. I don't pretend to understand it, but I can see that he's different, better. He's speaking again, and that's something I had stopped hoping for." Elena inclined her head slightly, accepting his gratitude without false modesty. "Timothy is a remarkable child," she replied. "He was never broken. He was just waiting for the right moment to let the world hear what he had to say. But that's what I don't understand," Jonathan continued, leaning forward slightly. "The specialists I consulted said that selective mutism was a serious condition that required professional intervention. They gave me detailed treatment plans and specific techniques, none of which seemed to help. You've accomplished in a few months what trained therapists couldn't do in 3 years." "How?" Elena considered her answer carefully, aware that everything depended on finding the right balance between honesty and discretion. "In my experience," she said finally, "children learn best when they don't realize they're being taught. Timothy doesn't think of our time together as therapy or treatment. He thinks of it as friendship, as play, as discovery. There's no pressure to perform or meet expectations. There's just the joy of finding out what's possible. Jonathan nodded slowly, but she could see that her answer hadn't fully satisfied him. "Where did you learn to speak so many languages?" he asked. Timothy mentioned German and French and several others I couldn't identify. That's not something you pick up casually. This was the moment Elena had been preparing for. The question that would determine whether she could continue to be part of Timothy's life on her own terms. "I grew up in a household where languages were as common as breathing," she said, which was true if incomplete. "My father believed that every language you learn makes you a little bit more human, a little bit more capable of understanding other people's experiences. I learned some formally, others informally. I learned because I was curious, because I loved the sounds words made, because I wanted to read books in the languages their authors wrote them in." "And you never pursued formal education in linguistics or language teaching?" Elena met his eyes steadily. "I pursued education wherever I found it, Mr. Hampton. In classrooms when they were available, in conversations when they weren't. I learned from professors and immigrants and children and books and songs and mistakes. I don't think wisdom requires a particular setting to bloom." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her words. Elena could see him struggling with concepts that didn't fit neatly into his businessman's understanding of qualifications and credentials. Finally, he asked the question she had been dreading. "What do you want from us, Elena? What's your end game here?" The directness of the question caught her off guard, even though she had been expecting it. She saw suspicion in his eyes now, the wariness of a wealthy man who had learned to be cautious about people's motives. He was wondering if she was some kind of con artist, if there was an angle he wasn't seeing, if her interest in Timothy was really about getting access to the Hampton fortune. "I want Timothy to remember that he has a voice," Elena said quietly. "I want him to understand that being different doesn't mean being deficient. I want him to grow up knowing that intelligence comes in many forms, that curiosity is more valuable than certainty, that the ability to connect with other human beings is the most important skill anyone can develop. If I can help him discover those things, then I will have done enough." The sincerity in her voice seemed to reach something in Jonathan that his skepticism couldn't touch. He looked down at his untouched soup, then back at her, and she saw his expression soften. "Timothy talks about you constantly," he said. "Not to me, not yet, but Margaret hears him. He calls you his friend, his teacher, I think the word was rescuer, though he said it in Italian, so Margaret wasn't entirely sure. You've become very important to him. And he to me," Elena replied simply. "That creates a responsibility," Jonathan continued. "If Timothy becomes too dependent on you, what happens when you decide to move on? What happens to his progress if you leave?" Elena had been afraid of this question because she didn't have a good answer for it. The truth was that she had grown attached to Timothy in ways that surprised her, that leaving him now would feel like abandoning a child who had trusted her with his most vulnerable self. But she also knew that her presence in the Hampton household was temporary by definition. She was a cleaning lady who had stumbled into an extraordinary situation, not a permanent solution to Timothy's needs. "I think," she said slowly, "that Timothy is stronger than you give him credit for. What he's learning isn't just vocabulary or grammar. He's learning that communication is possible, that he has things worth saying, that other people want to listen. Those are lessons that stay with you regardless of who taught them." "But would you stay?" Jonathan asked suddenly. "If I asked you to? If I offered you a position as Timothy's tutor, would you consider it?" The offer hung between them like a bridge that could either connect their two worlds or collapse under the weight of unspoken complications. Elena felt the pull of possibility, the temptation to step out of the shadows and claim her expertise openly. She could have a real title, fair compensation, the respect that came with being acknowledged as a professional rather than just a domestic worker. But she also knew that accepting would change everything. Timothy's education would become formal, structured, subject to curricula and assessments, and all the institutional pressures that could squeeze the joy out of learning. Jonathan would want reports and progress markers and evidence that his investment was paying dividends. The magic that happened in quiet moments between a curious child and someone who understood his needs would be transformed into something measurable and therefore manageable. Most importantly, accepting Jonathan's offer would require her to reveal her credentials, to explain about Dr. Elena Santos and the life she had left behind. Once that truth was out, she would never again be able to simply sit on the floor of a library with a lonely child, reading poetry in languages most people had never heard of, creating safety through presence rather than technique. "Mr. Hampton," she said finally, "I'm honored by your offer. But I think what Timothy needs most right now is exactly what he's getting. Someone who sees him as a complete person rather than a project. Someone who can meet him where he is rather than where experts think he should be. If you try to make our relationship official, you risk changing it into something that serves your peace of mind more than his actual needs. Jonathan's face showed disappointment, but also a grudging respect for her position. You're saying I should just trust you, he said. Trust that whatever you're doing will continue to help him. Even though I don't understand it and can't control it. I'm saying you should trust Timothy, Elena corrected gently. Watch him. Listen to him. Let him show you what's working. Children are remarkably good at knowing what they need if adults are willing to pay attention. The rest of their dinner passed in more comfortable conversation, with Jonathan asking about Timothy's interests and Elena sharing observations about his curiosity and intelligence. She could see the father in him gradually relaxing as he realized that her affection for his son was genuine, that whatever her mysteries might be, her commitment to Timothy's well-being was absolute. When Margaret came to clear the dessert plates, Jonathan made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Elena, he said, I'd like to ask you to continue exactly what you've been doing with Timothy. Not as his official tutor, but as his friend and mentor. I'll increase your salary to reflect the additional responsibility, but I won't ask you to change your methods or report on your progress. I'll simply trust that you know what's best for him. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Thank you, Mr. Hampton. I think that's exactly what Timothy needs. But I have one condition, Jonathan added, his businessman's instincts reasserting themselves. If Timothy's well-being ever requires it, if there's ever a crisis or a setback, I want you to promise me that you'll tell me everything. About your background, your qualifications, whatever knowledge you're drawing on to help him. Can you promise me that? Elena met his eyes, seeing in them the love of a father who would do anything to protect his child, even if it meant confronting truths he might not want to hear. I promise, she said, and meant it. That night, as Elena walked back to her room through the mansion's quiet corridors, she felt the weight of the choice she had made. She had bought herself and Timothy more time, space to continue their unconventional education without interference. But she had also accepted a responsibility that went beyond teaching languages or helping a traumatized child find his voice. She had become part of Timothy's life in a way that couldn't be easily undone. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges they faced, she would have to find ways to protect his progress while navigating the complex dynamics of a household where secrets and intentions rarely aligned with surface appearances. In his room, Timothy lay awake thinking about the conversation he hadn't been allowed to hear, but whose outcome he could sense in the atmosphere of the house. Tomorrow, Elena would still be there. Tomorrow, they would still meet in the library to explore new words and old stories. Tomorrow, the impossible education that had saved them both would continue. But Timothy was old enough to understand that tomorrow was never guaranteed, and smart enough to know that the most important questions were still waiting to be asked and answered. Who was Elena, really? Why had she come to them? And what would happen when the truth about her past finally emerged from the shadows where she kept it hidden? Outside, November winds rattled the mansion's windows, carrying with them the promise of changes that no one could predict or control. The crisis came in December, swift and unexpected as winter storms often do. Timothy had been making remarkable progress, speaking freely with Elena, and beginning to communicate more with Margaret, and even occasionally with his father. His confidence was growing daily, nurtured by the gentle rhythm of unconventional lessons that felt more like play than formal education. Then, Dr. Richardson arrived. Jonathan had been contacted by the school district about Timothy's enrollment for the following year. Standard assessments would be required, they explained, to determine appropriate placement. Dr. Richardson was their most experienced child psychologist, specializing in cases involving selective mutism and developmental delays. She came highly recommended and carried with her an arsenal of tests, evaluations, and diagnostic tools designed to measure Timothy's progress in quantifiable terms. Elena watched from the kitchen window as the doctor's sleek car pulled into the estate's circular drive. She had been expecting this moment since her dinner with Jonathan, knowing that eventually the outside world would intrude on the careful sanctuary they had built. But seeing it happen still felt like watching storm clouds gather on a clear horizon. Dr. Richardson was everything Elena was not. Polished, credentialed, armed with decades of formal training and peer-reviewed research. She swept into the Hampton mansion with the confident authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, her briefcase full of standardized assessments and evidence-based interventions. The first session did not go well. Timothy, confronted with unfamiliar tests and clinical questions, retreated into the silence that had protected him for so long. Dr. Richardson's carefully structured activities bounced off him like rain off stone, leaving her frustrated and Timothy increasingly anxious. By the end of the 2-hour evaluation, both doctor and patient were exhausted, and no meaningful communication had occurred. "That's quite normal for initial sessions," Dr. Richardson assured Jonathan afterward, her tone professionally optimistic despite the obvious setback. "Children with selective mutism often require time to adjust to new therapeutic relationships. However, I am concerned about some of the informal interventions that seem to have been attempted here." She gestured toward the library, where Elena's influence was evident in the multilingual books scattered across low tables and the comfortable reading nooks that had replaced formal study areas. "Exposing a child with communication disorders to multiple languages simultaneously can actually impede progress," Dr. Richardson continued. "The brain needs to master one linguistic system before it can safely process others. I'm afraid whoever has been working with Timothy may have inadvertently complicated his recovery." Jonathan felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Everything he thought he understood about Timothy's progress was suddenly being questioned by someone whose expertise he couldn't doubt. But he had seen his son speaking, laughing, engaged with learning in ways that had seemed impossible just months before. "What do you recommend?" he asked, dreading the answer. "We need to implement a structured intervention plan immediately," Dr. Richardson replied, opening her briefcase to reveal neatly organized files and assessment forms. "First, we'll need to eliminate the confusing linguistic input Timothy has been receiving. Multiple languages should be removed from his environment until he demonstrates mastery of English communication. Second, we'll establish a formal therapy schedule with measurable goals and regular progress evaluations." She paused, consulting her notes. "I'll also need to speak with whoever has been providing these informal language lessons. It's crucial that all adults in Timothy's environment understand the importance of consistency in therapeutic approaches." Elena knew the conversation was coming before Margaret delivered the message. Dr. Richardson requested her presence in the library at 3 o'clock, ostensibly to discuss Timothy's daily routine, but really to assess the damage that an untrained amateur might have caused to a vulnerable child's development. She found Dr. Richardson waiting among the books that had become Timothy's playground, the psychologist's expression professionally neutral, but unmistakably disapproving. The warm, lived-in feeling of the space seemed to offend her sensibilities, as if healing should only happen in sterile clinical environments, with proper supervision. "Ms. Santos," Dr. Richardson began, consulting a tablet where she had apparently been taking notes about the room's contents. "Mr. Hampton tells me you've been working with Timothy on language development. I'd like to understand your approach so we can coordinate our efforts effectively." Elena settled into one of the comfortable chairs she and Timothy had arranged for their reading sessions, sensing that this conversation would determine not just her own future, but Timothy's as well. "I spend time with Timothy," she said simply. "We read together, we talk together, we explore ideas together. Nothing more complicated than that." Dr. Richardson's stylus moved across her tablet screen, recording observations that would probably become part of Timothy's permanent file. "I see you've introduced him to multiple foreign languages simultaneously. Can you explain the theoretical basis for that decision?" The question was designed to expose Elena's lack of formal training, to reveal her as the well-meaning but potentially harmful amateur that Dr. Richardson clearly believed her to be. It was a trap that would have been impossible to escape without revealing credentials Elena had spent months keeping hidden. Instead, she chose a different kind of honesty. "Timothy asked me how to say beautiful in other languages after he saw a sunset that took his breath away," Elena replied. "I told him. Then he asked how other people around the world said, 'Thank you,' and 'I love you,' and 'I'm sorry.' I told him those too." It wasn't a theoretical decision, Dr. Richardson. It was a human one. The psychologist's expression remained neutral, but Elena caught a flicker of something that might have been condescension. "While I appreciate your emotional connection to Timothy, Ms. Santos, child development is far more complex than simply responding to curiosity. Selective mutism requires specialized intervention based on peer-reviewed research and clinical best practices. Well-meaning but untrained individuals can actually harm a child's progress by reinforcing maladaptive patterns." Elena felt something dangerous rising in her chest, a protective fury that threatened to sweep away months of careful discretion. This woman, with her tablets and assessments and clinical terminology, was describing Timothy as if he were a collection of symptoms rather than a brilliant, sensitive child who had been failed by every expert who had tried to fix him. "Dr. Richardson," Elena said, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that made the psychologist look up from her notes. "How many languages do you speak?" The question seemed to catch Dr. Richardson off guard. "I speak English fluently, and I have conversational ability in Spanish from my undergraduate studies. But I fail to see how that's relevant to Timothy's treatment plan." Elena stood and walked to one of the bookshelves, pulling down a volume of poetry that Timothy had been particularly drawn to the week before. "He read this to me yesterday," she said, opening to a page marked with a pressed flower. In Portuguese first, then in English, then in French. He understood every word, not because someone drilled vocabulary into him, but because the emotions in the poems spoke to something in his heart that transcends language barriers. She turned to face Dr. Richardson directly, and for the first time since arriving at the Hampton estate, Elena allowed her full intelligence to show in her eyes. "You want to know my theoretical basis?" she continued. "It's this. Children learn best when they feel safe, valued, and understood." Timothy wasn't silent because he couldn't speak. He was silent because nobody had given him anything worth saying in a world that would truly listen. "The languages aren't teaching him communication skills, Dr. Richardson. They're teaching him that his thoughts and feelings matter enough to be expressed in the most beautiful ways human beings have ever devised." Dr. Richardson's professional composure faltered slightly. She was clearly dealing with someone more formidable than she had expected. Someone who challenged her assumptions in ways that formal training hadn't prepared her for. "Ms. Santos," she said, attempting to regain control of the conversation, "I understand that you care about Timothy. But caring isn't enough when dealing with serious developmental challenges. What Timothy needs is evidence-based intervention provided by qualified professionals who understand the complexities of his condition." Elena looked at the woman across from her, seeing not an enemy, but someone who genuinely believed she was protecting Timothy's best interests. Dr. Richardson had spent years learning how to help children like Timothy, had dedicated her career to understanding the intricate workings of developing minds, had probably helped countless families navigate the maze of childhood psychological challenges. But she had also never sat with a silent child in a library full of forgotten books, watching understanding bloom like flowers after rain. She had never seen the moment when fear transforms into curiosity, when isolation becomes connection, when a wounded heart discovers it can still trust enough to try again. "Dr. Richardson," Elena said softly, "I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you. I have a doctorate in applied linguistics from Georgetown University. I specialized in childhood language acquisition disorders. I've published research on multilingual development in traumatized children. I understand the theoretical frameworks you're referring to better than you might expect." The tablet slipped from Dr. Richardson's hands, clattering to the floor in a moment of silence that seemed to stretch for hours. Elena continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know what the textbooks say about selective mutism, about appropriate interventions, about evidence-based practices. I helped write some of those textbooks. But I also know that Timothy isn't a case study or a diagnostic category. He's a little boy who lost his mother and couldn't find words big enough to hold that kind of pain. The languages I share with him aren't confusing his recovery, Dr. Richardson. They're giving him tools to build something beautiful from the pieces of his broken heart." Dr. Richardson retrieved her tablet with shaking hands, her professional authority crumbling as she tried to process this revelation. You're Dr. Santos, but why are you working as a cleaning lady?" Elena finished. "Because sometimes the most important work happens in places where nobody expects to find it. Because credentials don't heal hearts. Because Timothy needed someone who could see him as extraordinary rather than damaged. And it turned out that someone was a woman who lost her father, her career, and her certainty about everything except the power of human connection to save us from our deepest sorrows." The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted their conversation. Timothy appeared in the doorway, his young face showing the anxiety that had been building since Dr. Richardson's arrival. He looked between the two women, sensing the tension that hung in the air like smoke. "Elena," he said in Portuguese, switching to their private language for difficult emotions, "are you in trouble because of me?" Elena knelt to his eye level, taking his hands in hers. "Never," she replied in the same language. "You could never be trouble for me, Timothy. You are joy and wonder and possibility." You are the reason I remember why learning matters." Dr. Richardson watched this exchange with growing understanding. She was witnessing something that couldn't be measured with any assessment tool, couldn't be replicated through clinical intervention. This was love in action, wisdom born from suffering, healing that happened one conversation at a time between two souls who recognized each other across the landscape of their mutual wounds. Timothy looked at Dr. Richardson and, in careful English, said, "Elena teaches me that words are gifts we give each other. She doesn't try to fix me because I'm not broken. She just helps me find new ways to say what's in my heart." The profound simplicity of his statement hung in the library like a benediction. Dr. Richardson looked at this child who had supposedly been too damaged to communicate effectively, who was now expressing concepts about language and healing that showed remarkable emotional intelligence and sophistication. "Timothy," she said gently, "would you like to show me some of the things you've been learning with Elena?" For the next hour, Timothy shared his world with Dr. Richardson. He read poetry in 4 languages, explained the cultural context of different expressions of gratitude, showed her the notebook where he had been recording new words like treasures in a collection. His confidence grew as he spoke, his natural curiosity overcoming the anxiety that had paralyzed him during their formal assessment session. Dr. Richardson found herself revising everything she thought she knew about appropriate interventions for children with selective mutism. This child wasn't being harmed by exposure to multiple languages. He was being enriched by them, using them as stepping stones to rebuild his relationship with communication itself. When Timothy finally ran out of things to show her, Dr. Richardson turned to Elena with an expression that had transformed from skepticism to wonder. "Dr. Santos," she said, "I owe you an apology, and I think I need to revise my treatment recommendations for Timothy." That evening, Dr. Richardson presented Jonathan with a report unlike any she had written in her 20-year career. Instead of standardized test scores and diagnostic categories, she described a child who was thriving under the care of someone whose unconventional methods had achieved results that traditional therapy had failed to produce. "Timothy doesn't need intervention," she explained to Jonathan in his study. "He needs exactly what he's getting. Someone who understands that healing happens through relationship, that learning flourishes in environments of safety and acceptance, that children recover from trauma when they're given reasons to believe the world is worth speaking to again." She paused, looking out the window toward the library where Elena and Timothy could be seen reading together by lamplight. "Your cleaning lady, Mr. Hampton, is one of the most gifted educators I've ever encountered. Whatever you're paying her, it's not enough." Jonathan listened to Dr. Richardson's revised assessment with a mixture of vindication and confusion. Everything Elena had told him about trusting Timothy's instincts, about meeting him where he was rather than where experts thought he should be, had been proven correct. But questions remained about Elena herself, about the credentials she had hidden and the life she had left behind. The next morning, he found Elena in the conservatory, tending to the orchids that had become symbols of impossible growth in unlikely circumstances. Timothy was at school, reluctantly attending his first day back after the evaluation, armed with new confidence and a notebook full of encouraging words in a dozen languages. "Dr. Richardson told me about your background," Jonathan said without preamble. "She said you're one of the most qualified people in the country to work with children like Timothy." Elena continued pruning dead leaves from a plant that was preparing to bloom after years of dormancy. "Qualifications are complicated things, Mr. Hampton. I was qualified on paper when I couldn't help my own father remember the word for water. I was qualified when I watched brilliant children fail in classrooms that measured intelligence in all the wrong ways. Sometimes being qualified means knowing when to forget what you've been taught and pay attention to what actually works." Jonathan moved closer, studying this woman who had been hiding in plain sight for months, cleaning his house while possessing knowledge that universities paid fortunes to access. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Why let me think you were just a cleaning lady?" Elena finished, meeting his eyes with steady calm. "Because Timothy didn't need Dr. Santos with her degrees and publications and professional reputation. He needed Elena, who understood what it meant to lose everything and have to rebuild from silence. He needed someone who could sit with his pain without trying to analyze it away, who could offer him beauty without demanding performance in return." She gestured toward the orchids surrounding them, their exotic blooms proof that magnificent things could grow from patient, invisible care. "The moment you start paying someone to be an expert, Mr. Hampton, you change the relationship. Suddenly there are expectations and assessments and measurable outcomes. The magic that happens between a curious child and someone who genuinely enjoys his company gets buried under professional obligations and therapeutic goals. Jonathan understood, even as part of him rebelled against the implications. Elena was telling him that the best thing he could do for his son was to continue allowing their relationship to exist outside normal categories, to resist the urge to formalize and control what was working precisely because it couldn't be formalized or controlled. But what happens when Timothy gets older? Jonathan asked. When he needs more structured education? When the outside world demands accountability? Elena smiled, the expression carrying both sadness and hope. Then we'll figure it out together, she said. Timothy is learning that he has a voice worth hearing, that his thoughts matter, that the world is full of beauty waiting to be discovered. Those are foundations that will serve him regardless of what structure gets built on top of them. Over the following months, the Hampton household settled into a new rhythm that honored both Timothy's extraordinary gifts and the unconventional circumstances that had revealed them. Elena continued her cleaning duties, but everyone understood now that her real work happened in quiet moments between tasks, when a curious child sought her out for conversations that ranged across languages and cultures and ideas too large for any single vocabulary to contain. Timothy thrived in ways that amazed everyone who knew his history. His confidence grew daily, nurtured by success in communicating with people who valued what he had to say. He began teaching other children at school simple phrases in different languages, becoming a bridge between cultures in the way that only children can manage. Teachers who had worried about his developmental delays found themselves learning from a boy who thought in concepts that transcended linguistic boundaries. Dr. Richardson became a regular visitor to the estate, not as Timothy's therapist, but as someone eager to understand Elena's methods well enough to apply them with other children. She published papers about the case that revolutionized thinking about multilingual intervention in childhood trauma recovery, always protecting Timothy's privacy, while sharing insights that helped countless other families. Elena's secret identity as Dr. Santos remained closely guarded, known only to Jonathan, Dr. Richardson, and Margaret, who had appointed herself the unofficial guardian of information that might disrupt the delicate ecosystem that had formed around Timothy's healing. To the rest of the world, Elena remained exactly what she appeared to be, a cleaning woman who happened to possess extraordinary gifts for connecting with children who had been failed by more conventional approaches. Jonathan's relationship with his son transformed as well. Watching Elena's patient, respectful approach to Timothy's education taught him to listen more and direct less, to trust his child's curiosity rather than trying to control its expression. He learned to value the questions Timothy asked as much as the answers he provided, to see wonder as more important than achievement. The seasons turned from winter to spring to summer, each bringing new growth and new discoveries. Timothy's vocabulary expanded in all directions, but more importantly, his capacity for connection deepened. He learned to express not just facts and ideas, but feelings and dreams, and the subtle observations that made him uniquely himself. One evening in late summer, as Elena was finishing her work in the library, Timothy found her arranging flowers from the estate's gardens in the vases that his mother had loved. The air was warm and golden, filled with the scent of roses and the distant sound of evening birds settling into their nests. "Elena," Timothy said, switching to Spanish because it was the language they used for the most important conversations, "will you always be here?" The question had been waiting in both their hearts for months, gathering weight as Timothy grew older, and Elena's presence became more essential to his sense of safety in the world. She set down the flowers she had been arranging and gave him her full attention. "I will be here as long as you need me to be here," she replied, also in Spanish. "But Timothy, part of what I'm teaching you is that you carry everything important inside yourself. The languages, the curiosity, the ability to connect with other people. Those are yours now. They don't depend on any one person to keep them alive." Timothy nodded solemnly, understanding more than his years should have allowed. But he also reached out and took Elena's hand, holding it with the trust that had anchored both their healings. "I know," he said, "but knowing I can swim doesn't mean I don't want the ocean to still be there." Elena felt tears prick her eyes at the poetry of his response, at the way he could find metaphors that captured truths too complex for simpler language. This was what recovery looked like, she realized. Not the absence of wounds, but the transformation of them into wisdom, into capacity for deeper connection, into the kind of strength that could only come from surviving great loss and choosing to remain open to great love. The summer evening stretched around them, full of promise and possibility. Through the library windows, they could see Jonathan on the terrace, reading reports in the fading light, occasionally looking up to watch his son through the glass, with an expression of wonder that had replaced the worried vigilance of earlier months. Margaret moved through the house, completing her evening tasks, humming softly in contentment at the way peace had settled over a household that had known too much sorrow for too long. The orchids in the conservatory prepared for another season of blooming, their roots strong in soil that Elena's patient care had enriched beyond measure. And in the library where it all began, a woman who had lost everything and a boy who had found his voice continued the conversation that had saved them both. They spoke in languages that spanned continents and centuries, weaving together words and ideas and dreams in patterns that no textbook had ever described, but that every heart could recognize as the sound of healing happening one syllable at a time. Timothy grew up to become a translator for the United Nations, using his gift for languages to help people from different cultures understand each other in moments of conflict and confusion. He never forgot the woman who taught him that words were bridges, that silence could be as eloquent as speech, that the most important lessons happened in the spaces between formal education where love and curiosity met to create possibilities that no one had imagined before. Elena continued working as a cleaning lady for the rest of her life, finding in humble labor a satisfaction that academic achievement had never provided. She taught languages informally to anyone who asked, turning pantries and garden sheds into classrooms where immigrants and refugees and lonely children discovered that learning could be an act of love rather than obligation. She never returned to her identity as Dr. Santos, never reclaimed the credentials that had once defined her worth. Instead, she became something more valuable and more necessary, a keeper of stories, a builder of bridges, a reminder that wisdom flows in channels that no institution can control or contain. Years later, when Timothy brought his own children to visit the Hampton estate, he would take them to the library where a portrait of Elena hung beside one of his mother. He would tell them about the woman who taught him that every language learned makes you a little more human, that every story shared builds a little more understanding, that every act of patient attention to another person's heart changes the world in ways too important to measure. And sometimes, if they were very quiet and very lucky, his children could hear echoes of all those conversations that had filled the mansion with the sound of healing, the whisper of pages turning in books that held the secrets of human connection, the gentle rhythm of learning that happened when two souls recognized each other across the landscape of their shared need to be understood. The cleaning lady had never gone to school in the way most people understood education, but she had taught a millionaire's son 10 languages, and in doing so, she had taught the world something profound about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between instruction and inspiration, between being qualified and being called to serve the deepest needs of another human heart.